November 1991, Wembley Arena, London. 15,000 fans packed into one of Europe's most prestigious venues, their voices already hoarse from singing along to Whitney Houston's opening numbers. The Greatest Love of All tour was at its absolute peak, and this night was being broadcast live across Europe. Whitney had just finished a powerful rendition of How Will I Know and was transitioning into the intimate, emotional section of her show. Everything was perfect, electric, magical. But then, during the opening notes of I'm Every Woman, something completely unexpected happened that would stop the concert, shock 15,000 people, and reveal a connection so profound that it would change Whitney's entire perspective on legacy, family, and the invisible threads that connect us all across generations. A young woman in the third row managed to catch Whitney's attention, holding up not a typical concert sign or flowers, but a weathered photograph in a simple wooden frame. At first, Whitney smiled and waved, assuming it was just another fan gift. But as the woman kept the photo raised high, something about it pulled Whitney's focus. She stopped singing mid-verse, her powerful voice trailing off as she squinted into the stage lights, trying to see what the image contained. The band, confused but professional, continued playing as Whitney walked to the edge of the stage, knelt down, and accepted the frame from the trembling hands of the young woman. What Whitney saw in that photograph made her gasp audibly, and the sound carried through her wireless microphone to every corner of the massive arena. Her legs seemed to give way slightly, and she sat down right there on the stage floor, staring at an image from a world she thought only existed in her own memories. The photograph showed a small, humble church basement in Newark, New Jersey. The year had to be around 1971 or 1972, based on the clothing and hairstyles. In the center of the image stood a younger Cissy Houston, Whitney's mother, positioned at an old, upright piano. Around Cissy were 5 or 6 young women, clearly taking a vocal lesson. The quality was grainy. The colors had faded to warm sepia tones, but the moment captured was unmistakably real and intimate. But what made Whitney's hands shake as she held this frame was not just seeing her mother as a young woman, or recognizing the church basement where she herself had spent countless childhood hours. It was the little girl sitting in the corner of the photograph, barely visible, maybe 5 or 6 years old, with her legs crossed and a church hymnal in her lap. That little girl was Whitney herself, and she had absolutely no memory of this photograph ever being taken. But here's what made this moment even more extraordinary and what Whitney was about to discover. The young woman who handed her the photograph wasn't just a random fan with a lucky find at an estate sale. She was intimately connected to that church basement, to that vocal lesson, and to the very moment when Whitney Houston's destiny was being shaped by forces she never knew existed. The truth about this photograph would reveal a debt that Whitney never knew she owed and a legacy that stretched far beyond her own incredible voice. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, and at 26 years old, she had been carrying that photograph across an ocean specifically to give it to Whitney Houston. Sarah wasn't from London. She was from Newark, New Jersey, from the same neighborhood where Whitney had grown up, from the same church community that had nurtured the Houston family's musical gifts. But Sarah's connection to Whitney went deeper than geography or church membership. That photograph represented the single most important moment in Sarah's family history, and she had spent 3 years in her life savings to make sure Whitney understood why. Sarah's mother, Diana Mitchell, was one of the young women in that photograph, standing directly beside Cissy Houston at the piano. Diana had been 19 years old when that picture was taken, a young single mother with a beautiful voice, but no formal training, no connections, and no realistic path to her music career. Diana had grown up in the poorest section of Newark, raised by a grandmother who cleaned houses, and had gotten pregnant at 17 by a man who disappeared before Sarah was born. By 19, Diana was working 2 jobs, singing in the church choir on Sundays, and trying to imagine a future that offered something more than survival. Cissy Houston had noticed Diana's voice during a Sunday service and approached her after church with an offer that would change everything. Cissy was already an established backup vocalist, having sung with Aretha Franklin and Elvis Presley, but she believed deeply in giving back to her community. She had started offering free vocal lessons in the church basement every Tuesday evening, and she wanted Diana to join. Diana had been terrified. convinced she wasn't good enough, that she didn't belong in the same room as someone of Cissy Houston's caliber. But Cissy had been insistent, even offering to watch baby Sarah during the lessons, so Diana would have no excuse not to come. For 6 months during 1971 and 1972, Diana Mitchell attended every single Tuesday lesson. Cissy taught her not just vocal technique, but confidence, professionalism, and the belief that her voice mattered. Diana learned to read music, to control her breathing, to find the emotional truth in every lyric. Cissy never charged a single dollar, never asked for anything in return, never made Diana feel like charity. She simply shared her knowledge with the same generosity that had been shown to her when she was young and struggling. The photograph that Whitney was now holding had been taken on the last night of those lessons by the church's pastor, who wanted to document Cissy's community work. But what nobody in that room knew, including Cissy herself, was that Diana Mitchell was already sick. The persistent cough she'd attributed to a cold was actually the first symptom of the lung disease that would take her life just 8 months later. Diana never got to use the training Cissy gave her. She never got to pursue the music career she'd begun to dream about. But in those final months of her life, as her breathing became more difficult and her strength faded, Diana would tell baby Sarah stories about the church basement, about the kind woman who had believed in her voice, and about the little girl who sat in the corner during lessons, watching everything with enormous, observant eyes. Diana Mitchell died in April 1973, when Sarah was barely 2 years old. Sarah grew up with her grandmother, the same woman who had raised Diana, in the same tiny Newark apartment, with the same struggles and limited options. But Sarah had something Diana never had. She had that photograph, carefully preserved in its frame, and she had her grandmother's stories about the Tuesday night lessons and the Houston family's unexpected kindness. As Sarah grew older and Whitney Houston became a global superstar, that photograph took on almost mythical significance in the Mitchell household. It represented a moment when someone successful and important had seen value in someone the world overlooked. It represented the education Diana never got to complete and the dreams she never got to fulfill. When Sarah was 23, her grandmother died, leaving her truly alone in the world. Sarah had followed a practical path, becoming a nurse rather than pursuing any musical dreams, convinced that music was for people with connections and opportunities she would never have. But as she sorted through her grandmother's belongings after the funeral, she found a letter Diana had written to Cissy Houston just weeks before she died. The letter had never been mailed, perhaps because Diana was too sick, or too proud, or simply ran out of time. Sarah sat on her grandmother's worn carpet and read her mother's words for the first time. The letter was heartbreaking in its gratitude and hope. Diana wrote about how Cissy's lessons had given her a glimpse of who she could have been, how those Tuesday evenings were the only time she felt like more than just a struggling single mother. Diana wrote about watching little Whitney during the lessons, seeing how the child absorbed everything, and feeling certain that Whitney would someday do something extraordinary with her voice. The final paragraph of the letter contained a request that Diana never got to fulfill. She asked Cissy to tell Whitney, when she was old enough to understand, that her mother's kindness had meant everything to someone the world would never know, and that Whitney should use her voice not just to entertain, but to lift up people who felt invisible the way Diana had felt invisible. Reading that unmailed letter changed everything for Sarah Mitchell. She realized that Whitney Houston had no idea about the Tuesday night lessons, no idea that her mother's generosity had touched lives in ways that never made headlines, no idea that a woman named Diana Mitchell had died believing that the little girl in the corner of that church basement was destined for greatness. Sarah made a decision that night that would take 3 years to fulfill. She would find a way to give Whitney that photograph and tell her about Diana Mitchell. Not because she wanted anything in return, but because her mother's final wish deserved to be honored, even if it was 18 years late. Getting that photograph to Whitney Houston proved far more difficult than Sarah had imagined. She tried mailing it to record companies, management offices, and fan mail addresses. Everything either went unanswered or came back with form letters thanking her for her support. She tried reaching out to people who claimed to have connections to Whitney's team, but they all turned out to be scammers wanting money. She even tried showing up at a concert in New York with the photograph, but security wouldn't let her anywhere near the backstage area. For 3 years, Sarah carried that photograph with her everywhere, waiting for the moment her grandmother had promised would come. The right time will find you. You just have to be ready when it does. The right time came in the form of a nursing conference in London that Sarah's hospital sent her to in November 1991. When she discovered that Whitney Houston would be performing at Wembley Arena during the same week, she spent money she didn't have on a concert ticket, positioned herself strategically in the third row, and prepared to do whatever it took to get that photograph into Whitney's hands. Sarah had rehearsed what she would say if she got the chance, had written a note explaining everything to attach to the frame, had prayed that somehow this moment would honor her mother's memory. But as Whitney Houston walked to the edge of that stage, knelt down, and took the photograph from her shaking hands, all of Sarah's prepared words disappeared. All she could manage to say was 4 words that carried 20 years of emotion. Your mother saved mine. Whitney Houston sat on the stage floor of Wembley Arena, staring at a photograph she had never seen before, holding a piece of her own history that she never knew existed. 15,000 fans watched in confused silence as their superstar seemed frozen, unable to speak or move. The band had stopped playing completely now, sensing that something profound was happening but uncertain what they should do. Whitney's finger traced the figures in the photograph, moving from her mother's young face to the women gathered around the piano, and finally to the small version of herself sitting in the corner. Tears began streaming down her face, and her voice, when she finally spoke into the microphone, was thick with emotion and disbelief. I remember this basement, Whitney said, her words carrying to every corner of the arena. I spent so much of my childhood in that church, but I never knew about these lessons. I never knew my mother did this. She looked up at Sarah, who was standing at the barrier now, crying herself. What did you say? About my mother saving yours? Sarah tried to speak, but her voice wouldn't cooperate. She was sobbing too hard, overwhelmed by the moment she had worked 3 years to create. A security guard handed her a microphone, and after taking several deep breaths, she managed to tell her story to 15,000 strangers and the woman who needed to hear it most. That's my mother in the photograph, Sarah said, pointing to Diana Mitchell's young face. Her name was Diana. She died when I was 2 years old. But before she died, she wrote a letter to your mother that she never got to send. A letter about how those Tuesday night lessons made her feel like her voice mattered, like her life had purpose. A letter about watching you as a little girl and knowing you're going to change the world with your voice. Sarah's voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. My mother's last wish was that you would know her story, that you would know your mother's kindness saved someone, even if that someone didn't live long enough to become famous or successful. She wanted you to understand that every person you touch with your voice, every person you help, they all matter, even the ones the world never hears about. The silence in Wembley Arena was absolute. 15,000 people seemed to be holding their breath collectively as Whitney absorbed Sarah's words. When Whitney finally stood up, still clutching the photograph, she walked to the microphone stand with a purpose that suggested she had made a decision. Ladies and gentlemen, Whitney said, her voice now steady and clear, carrying the full power of her instrument. I thought I came here tonight to sing songs and entertain you. But Sarah just reminded me why I really have this voice, why my mother spent all those years teaching people in church basements, why music matters more than fame or record sales or any of this. Whitney gestured to Sarah to join her on stage. Security helped Sarah over the barrier and up the steps, and suddenly she was standing beside Whitney Houston on the Wembley Arena stage, visible on the massive screens throughout the venue. Whitney put her arm around Sarah's shoulders and continued speaking. This is Sarah Mitchell. Her mother, Diana, was a student of my mother's, and I never knew it. Diana died young, and the world never got to hear her voice. But her daughter is here, and she just taught me something more valuable than any music lesson I ever received. What Whitney did next shocked everyone in that arena and everyone watching the broadcast. She made an announcement that would change Sarah Mitchell's life forever and reveal the depth of the Houston family's generosity across generations. But first, Whitney needed to understand something that the photograph had made her question for the first time in her life. Sarah, Whitney said, turning to face her directly, you said my mother saved yours. But I need to know something. Did your mother have dreams of her own? Before she got sick, what did she want to do with her voice? Sarah nodded. wiping tears from her face. She wanted to sing professionally. She wanted to record gospel music. My grandmother said Diana had started writing songs toward the end of those lessons, songs about struggle and hope and faith. But she never got to record them. She died too young. Whitney's expression shifted, and those who knew her well could see a determination taking hold. "Here's what we're going to do," Whitney announced to the arena. "Sarah, your mother's songs still exist, don't they? Did she write them down?" Sarah nodded. "She left notebooks. My grandmother kept them all." Whitney's smile was radiant now, transforming her tear-stained face into something powerful and purposeful. "Then Diana Mitchell is going to get her recording session. 20 years late, but it's going to happen. I'm going to take your mother's songs, I'm going to arrange them, produce them, and record them. And you're going to help me choose the singers, because this won't be about me. This will be about honoring your mother and every person like her whose voice deserved to be heard but never got the chance." The arena erupted in applause, but Whitney held up her hand for silence. "And one more thing. Sarah, what do you do for a living?" Sarah was so overwhelmed she could barely answer. "I'm a nurse." Whitney nodded as if this confirmed something she already suspected. "Of course you are. You help people, just like your mother wanted to help people with her music, just like my mother helped people with her lessons. Sarah, I want you to consider a different path. I want to fund a music education program in Newark, in that same church where this photograph was taken, and I want you to run it. We'll teach kids whose families can't afford lessons. We'll give them what my mother gave your mother, the belief that their voices matter." Sarah collapsed into Whitney's arms, crying so hard she couldn't stand on her own. Whitney held her tightly, and the embrace between these two women, separated by fame and fortune, but connected by an invisible thread of maternal love and generosity, became one of the most iconic images in concert history. The photograph that had started this entire moment sat on the stage floor between them, its presence radiating significance that stretched backward through time and forward into possibilities neither woman had imagined an hour earlier. But the story of that photograph and that night at Wembley Arena was far from over. What happened in the weeks and months that followed would prove that Whitney Houston's response was not just emotional spontaneity, but a genuine commitment to honoring Diana Mitchell's memory and transforming Sarah's life. The ripple effects of that single moment would eventually touch hundreds of lives and reveal truths about the Houston family that had been hidden for decades. The concert continued that night, but it was transformed by what had just occurred. Whitney dedicated every remaining song to Diana Mitchell and to all the voices that never got heard. When she sang "Greatest Love of All," the lyrics about children being the future took on new resonance, and there wasn't a dry eye in the venue. Sarah watched from the side of the stage, still in shock, still clutching the photograph that had finally fulfilled its purpose. After the show, Whitney spent 2 hours with Sarah in her dressing room, looking through photocopies of Diana's song lyrics that Sarah had brought with her, just in case. Whitney was moved by the raw honesty and spiritual depth of Diana's writing, and she made immediate plans to begin the recording project she had promised. But something else happened during that dressing room conversation that neither woman expected. When Whitney called her mother, Cissy Houston, to tell her about the photograph in Sarah's presence, Cissy's reaction was immediate and emotional. She remembered Diana Mitchell perfectly, remembered her beautiful voice and tragic early death, and revealed something that shocked both Whitney and Sarah. Cissy had tried to find Sarah after Diana died, wanting to help with funeral expenses and offer support, but the family had moved, and Cissy had lost track of them. For nearly 20 years, Cissy had wondered what happened to Diana's baby girl and had prayed that someone was taking care of her. The conversation between Cissy, Whitney, and Sarah that night became the foundation for something larger than any of them had initially imagined. Cissy flew to London immediately, and the reunion between Cissy Houston and Diana Mitchell's daughter was captured by Whitney's personal photographer. The images showed Cissy holding Sarah the way she might have held her own daughter, with tears streaming down both their faces, grieving together for a woman they had both loved and lost too soon. Cissy shared stories about Diana that Sarah had never heard, filled in details about her mother's personality and dreams that had been lost to time and death, and gave Sarah something she had never had, a direct connection to her mother's voice and aspirations. True to her word, Whitney began production on Diana Mitchell's songs within a month of the Wembley concert. She assembled a team of gospel music's finest vocalists, including her mother, and created arrangements that honored Diana's original vision while giving them professional polish. The recording session became an emotional event that Whitney documented on video, wanting Sarah to see how seriously she took the promise made on that London stage. Gospel legends like BB and Cissy Houston, Tremaine Hawkins, and members of the famed Clark sisters all participated, donating their time and talent to honor a woman they had never met but whose story had moved them profoundly. The resulting album, titled Diana's Songs, A Mother's Voice Across Time, was released not as a commercial project, but as a limited edition recording distributed to churches and community centers throughout Newark and other underserved communities. Whitney personally funded the entire production and ensured that every penny from any sales went directly to the music education program she had promised Sarah. But the album's impact went beyond its music. It became a symbol of something essential about artistic legacy and the invisible connections that bind us across generations. The music education program, officially named the Diana Mitchell Houston Academy in honor of both Diana and the Houston family, opened its doors in the basement of New Hope Baptist Church in Newark in September 1992. Sarah Mitchell, who had quit her nursing job to run the program full-time, stood beside Whitney and Cissy at the opening ceremony, holding that same photograph that had started everything. The church basement had been renovated and expanded, but the old, upright piano from Diana's lessons had been restored and held a place of honor in the main teaching room. On the wall above the piano hung an enlarged version of the photograph, with a plaque that read, Diana Mitchell, 1953 to 1973. Her voice lives on in every student who learns here. The program started with 15 students that first year, children from Newark's poorest neighborhoods who showed musical talent, but whose families couldn't afford private lessons. Sarah implemented a teaching philosophy that combined technical training with emotional support and community building, modeling the approach Cissy had used with Diana. Whitney visited regularly, sometimes teaching classes herself, always emphasizing to the students that their voices mattered regardless of whether they became famous. The program's success exceeded everyone's expectations. Within 5 years, it had expanded to serve over 200 students annually, and many graduates went on to successful careers in music, education, and other fields. But perhaps the most profound impact of that Wembley Arena moment was personal rather than institutional. Whitney Houston, who had spent her entire career being compared to her mother, always feeling the pressure of living up to Cissy's legacy, discovered through Sarah and Diana's story a deeper understanding of what legacy really meant. It wasn't about fame or commercial success or even extraordinary talent. It was about the moments of connection and generosity that rippled outward in ways you might never witness, touching lives you might never know about, creating chains of influence that stretched across generations. Sarah Mitchell became like a sister to Whitney, and their friendship deepened over the years as the academy grew and thrived. Sarah was one of the few people in Whitney's life who had known her before the impossible fame, who remembered the little girl sitting in the corner of that church basement, watching and learning. When Whitney went through her very public struggles with addiction and personal turmoil in the early 2000s, Sarah was there, providing support without judgment, reminding Whitney of who she had been and who she still was beneath the tabloid headlines. Their bond, forged by a photograph and sustained by a shared commitment to honoring Diana Mitchell's memory, became one of the most important relationships in Whitney's life. When Whitney Houston died, tragically in February 2012, Sarah Mitchell was among those who spoke at her funeral. Standing in the same New Hope Baptist Church where the Diana Mitchell Houston Academy had been founded 20 years earlier, Sarah held up that photograph one final time. She told the story of the Wembley Arena concert to a room filled with music industry legends and international media, but she told it with a purpose. She wanted the world to understand that Whitney's greatest performance wasn't any of her hit songs or spectacular concerts. It was the moment she sat on a stage floor, looked at a photograph of her childhood, and chose to honor a woman the world had forgotten. Whitney gave my mother a voice when everyone else had forgotten her name, Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. She gave me a purpose when I felt lost and alone. She created opportunities for hundreds of children who might have remained invisible. And she did all of this because she understood something that fame had never taught her, but that photograph somehow revealed. That we're all connected by invisible threads of love and generosity, and that the truest measure of a life isn't how famous you become, but how many people you lift up along the way. The Diana Mitchell Houston Academy continues to operate today, now serving over 500 students annually and expanded to include programs in dance, theater, and music production. The photograph that started everything still hangs above the restored piano, and every new student learns the story of Diana Mitchell, Cissy Houston, little Whitney sitting in the corner, and Sarah Mitchell's 3-year journey to deliver a message across time and an ocean. The Academy has produced Grammy winners, Broadway performers, music educators, and countless others who might never have discovered their voices without the opportunity Sarah and Whitney created. Sarah Mitchell, now in her 50s, still runs the Academy with the same passion and dedication she brought to it in 1992. She never married, never had children of her own, but she considers every student who passes through the Academy's doors to be part of her family, part of the legacy that began with her mother's Tuesday night lessons and was revived by a photograph handed across a stage barrier. In her office, alongside that famous photograph, hangs another image. Whitney and Sarah embracing at Wembley Arena, two women whose lives should never have intersected, but who were bound together by the invisible threads of maternal love, artistic generosity, and a profound belief that every voice deserves to be heard. The story of that photograph teaches us something essential about legacy and memory. Diana Mitchell died young, her dreams unfulfilled, her voice never recorded, her name forgotten by everyone except her own family. But her mother's kindness created a chain of generosity that stretched across 2 decades and eventually touched hundreds of lives. The Tuesday night lessons Cissy Houston gave for free in a church basement seemed insignificant at the time, just one small act of community service among many. But for Diana Mitchell, those lessons represented hope, dignity, and the belief that her voice had value. And when Diana's daughter carried that message back to Whitney Houston 20 years later, it transformed both women's understanding of what their voices were really for. We live in a world that measures success by fame, wealth, and public recognition. We celebrate the Whitney Houstons while forgetting the Diana Mitchells. We remember the spectacular concerts while overlooking the quiet moments of teaching and generosity that make those concerts possible. But the photograph that Sarah Mitchell handed to Whitney Houston on that November night in London reminds us that the most important legacies are often the invisible ones, the acts of kindness that ripple outward in ways we may never witness, touching lives we may never know about, creating possibilities that might not be realized for decades. Whitney Houston had one of the greatest voices in music history, and she used that voice to create beauty that will endure for generations. But perhaps her finest moment, her truest expression of what that voice was meant for, came when she sat on a stage floor, looked at a photograph of her mother teaching a woman the world would never remember, and chose to honor that forgotten woman's memory. In doing so, Whitney revealed that the purpose of extraordinary talent isn't just to entertain or achieve fame. It's to lift up the voices that might otherwise remain silent, to honor the dreams that might otherwise die unfulfilled, and to create opportunities for people who might otherwise remain invisible. The photograph still hangs in the Diana Mitchell Houston Academy, a reminder to every student who sees it that their voice matters, that their dreams deserve to be pursued, and that the kindness they show today might ripple outward in ways they cannot imagine, touching lives they will never meet, creating legacies that will outlive them all. Diana Mitchell never got to record her songs during her lifetime, but through her daughter's determination and Whitney Houston's generosity, her voice finally reached the world. And in reaching the world, it taught us all something more valuable than any hit song. That we are all connected by invisible threads of love and memory, and that the truest way to honor those who came before us is to lift up those who come after.